Hey, it's Red May all the way to June, all the way past capitalism to whatever comes next. We're ready for it. We'll talk about it today, what it might be, what it might look like. But before we do, I'd like to clue you in as what's on tap for the next few days. We have, I think, 12 events left before the end of Red May. So today at 6 p.m., belabored in Seattle, labor journalists Sarah Jaffe and Michelle Chen will talk to Cal Winslow, who's the author of a new book on the Seattle General Strike of 1919. So that will be quite interesting. Maybe we'll find a recipe for having the next one. On Monday at 1 p.m., Communism or Neo-Feudalism. It's Jody Dean's reframing of the famous socialism or barbarism alternative from Rosa Luxemburg. We will hear that and discuss it. Jason Reed and Eva Chernyevsky will be responding. At 5 p.m. on Monday, we have Dan Denver of Jacobins The Dig interviewing Holly Jean Buck, who's the author of a wonderful new book from Verso called After Geoengineering. And on Tuesday at 5 p.m., Thinking the Pandemic, State and Revolution with Andrew Anastasi, Jason Smith, Michael Bray, and Colleen Lai, and I'll be on that one too. So lots to come. Of course, pulling this off every year, putting on a month of events costs money, and we need it. We don't get it from institutions. Any event that has a slogan like "Be a commie for a month" doesn't find a lot of institutional money flowing its way. So we need you to look into your hearts and your pockets, bring out those credit cards, go to www.redmayseattle.org, click on donate, or go down to the YouTube description of the event, and there's a link there for donation. And also subscribe to our YouTube, our YouTube television channel, because if we get over 1,000 subscribers, and we're getting close, we get live real-time CC captions for the differently abled. So now I will turn the event over to our moderator, Hannah Atkinson, is a member of Seattle DSA and worked on the DSA for Bernie campaign. She's also been for the last 3 years the head of the Seattle Jacobin Reading Group, of which I am a member. Hannah, take it away.
All right, thank you for that lovely introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists here. I'm going to start with Jeremy Gilbert, who is a professor of cultural and political theory at the University of East London, where he has been based for many years. His most recent publications include the translation of Maria Lazzarato's Experimental Politics and the book Common Ground. His latest book, I think it came out last month, is 21st Century Socialism. All right, next up we have Nick Mitchell, who's trained in critical theory, Black radical thought, and feminist theory at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he received a PhD in the history of consciousness with an emphasis in feminist studies, and served as the founding coordinator of the Black Cultural Studies Research Cluster and the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Graduate Collective. After 2 years as faculty in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Riverside, Nick returned to the UCSC as faculty in 2015. All right, and then we have Olivia Hipley-Smith, who is the co-chair of the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America and a board member of CAIR Oregon, or CAIR, sorry, Oregon. Olivia is an Arab American socialist organizer with experience ranging from the local, national, and international levels in labor organizing, Palestinian solidarity, anti-fascism, and many other facets of anti-capitalist, anti-racist struggle. And finally, then we have Sarah Mason, who is a Lyft driver, DoorDasher, and graduate student studying platform-mediated labor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And then we have Alyssa Battistoni, who's a political theorist and an environmental fellow at the Harvard University Center for the Environment. She has written for The Nation, Dissent, and Plus One, Jacobin, and other publications. And she's the co-author of the recent book, planet to win, why we need a Green New Deal. All right, so thanks for joining us today in our virtual Red May. So one of my favorite things about Red May is that it's a month-long vacation from capitalism. And so I think kind of in that spirit, I want to open it by asking kind of a question. Feel free to jump in, of course, at any time. But Jeremy, you wrote recently in your book that the goal of 21st century, and this is a loose paraphrase, sorry, the goal of 21st century socialism is to organize our social lives in such a way as to maximize our real freedom. So take us. What's a day in the life of a really free person? What's that look like? You're muted, Jeremy.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, well, there's I guess there's two answers I would give, which are both like very familiar quotations that I'm sure people have heard before. I mean, Marx famously says, under a society not governed by the division of labor, that a person will be able to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, and we might choose different activities now, but the idea that life shouldn't be the life and the way we spend our time on a sort of personal basis shouldn't be completely determined by the demands of work is obviously crucial to any conception of freedom. And then my absolute favorite statement about the nature of freedom is it's a quote attributed to an unnamed SDS activist from the 60s, and the line is, "Freedom is an endless meeting." And this is a title of a really great book by Francesca Paletto, who's like a sort of historian of American social movements. And the idea, people, whenever I say this, people are kind of horrified. And my response, the idea that freedom, that what we want is a life which would be an endless meeting. And my response to that is always to say, well, the function of neoliberalism, one of the main ways in which neoliberalism has functioned, and which capitalism generally has functioned, is to, but particularly neoliberalism, has to condition us to the idea that meetings are necessarily kind of enervating, exhausting, pointless, for a waste of time, because the institutions and the processes of capitalism, of neoliberal post-democracy are all designed to make us, designed to produce a social reality whereby actually, doing things in a collaboratively with other people is impossible, and the attempt to do it just produces anxiety and frustration. But I think what's really sort of, for me, what's really manifest in that idea is the idea that, well, freedom can only be exercised in any meaningful way socially. And really what freedom would mean, or does mean, is the ability to exercise our social capacities as widely as possible, and as free and as openly as possible, and as creatively as possible. So what it would look like would mean, I do think what it would look like to live in a way which is truly free would be to spend a lot of time, whether it was virtually or online or in person, or mediated through artificial intelligence networks, or actually in neighborhood community centers or whatever. It will be a lot of time in some kind of meeting or other, actually making meaningful decisions about the lives that we lead and the disposition of social resources. So I think it would feel very different from the way in which that tends to feel today under those circumstances. So I think those would be my kind of two main ways of answering that, I think.
I love that idea of reclaiming the meeting. I think even in socialist organizations today, we're still working towards that. Like, how do we have meetings that feel free, like freedom, right?
Well, the meeting should be the meeting should feel like a party, and the party should feel like a meeting. That's the ultimate. That's the plane of consistency which we should be heading towards.
I like that. I think that's a very compelling vision of the future. I'm curious for especially those of us who are active in the Democratic Socialists of America, right? We have a lot of meetings, famously. I'm curious if anyone would like to weigh in on, how that's going. How could we make them more free, especially in this climate where we're all kind of virtual now? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I am, as you mentioned, the co-chair of the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, which often feels like an endless meeting. And I do think it's important that we have, a vision of what we want society to look like. But for me, this does feel like a bit of a utopian question. I think right now, especially as DSA, we need to talk more about how we can create the conditions to start moving there, you know, the practical implications and next steps. DSA is a big tent organization, so we have, Phil said in the chat, no Robert's Rules of Order. Yes, please, I'm so sick of Robert's Rules of Order. But DSA is a big tent organization, so there are actually lots of different and sometimes competing visions of what we want to build, but we're still like all building this thing together under this big anti-capitalist umbrella towards an anti-capitalist future. And I think what it looks like when we get there, to me, is a question for another day, because we are like running out of time. Like right now, we need to talk about what's the next step to get there. And I think also we need to remember that, of course, none of us are free until all of us are free. So, you know, we're not going to get free healthcare in college and even end poverty in the US and then we're done. You know, we're still in this imperialist machine that's oppressing and destroying the world. So, you know, there won't be a day in the life of a truly free person in the world until there is a free Palestine, until we can create this world without prisons and borders. And, you know, we're taking these steps towards those actions right now, you know, until we end the global imperial capitalist power of the United States and everything that comes with it, then we can start creating that vision.
Yeah, I think that's a really great and essential point. I think, you know, we're in a really great, really huge titanic struggle right now on this front. I think you know, I think one thing that, especially in the wake of kind of the loss of Sanders and Corbyn, I think we're kind of at a crossroads with how we kind of organize, and what kind of relationship does socialists play with the major parties, right? And what, in this kind of moment of crisis, you know, like Alyssa, you just wrote an article recently for Jacobin where you were discussing your book and you said, you know, worse is here, right? You know, climate change and all these crises, and now we have another new one. So how do we avoid letting this crisis go to waste? How do we reckon with the political losses? How do we reckon with our relationship with the parties?
Yeah, well, those are a lot of big questions, and I probably will not answer them sufficiently here, but I'll at least sort of say a bit about what we were thinking of. So when we wrote A Planet to Win, which I co-authored with Kate Aronoff, Danielle Donacohen, and Thea Francos, we, you know, wanted to lay out a vision of I think in many ways, some vision of a world that would be, I think, both sort of what Olivia and Jeremy are talking about in terms of getting us towards a vision of the kind of freedom that Jeremy's talking about. And I was happy to hear you mention freedom is an endless meeting, because when I was doing a lot of union organizing, we would always bring up that book title to each other and like kind of like lovingly groan about it. And I can say more about that later, but also to try to do some next steps type thinking along the lines that Olivia's describing. And so, you know, it's supposed to be kind of like radical pragmatism in some way, but we also, I think, recognize that even to get to some of the kind of, I think, interim steps of like, how can we imagine a world of like communal luxury and expanded public housing and transit and all of these kinds of things would require probably some both a lot of long-term organizing, but also moments of like possibility that are opened up by crises like the one we saw in 2008. And, you know, the 2008 financial crisis was really kind of a cautionary tale for us in a lot of ways, in terms of like a huge crisis that didn't go to waste, but not for us. You know, like we, or the left, I mean, the left has grown a lot since 2008, of course. And so I don't want to say like the left wasted that crisis at all. Like it's unimaginable that we would be where we are now without that. But we certainly weren't, you know, I think it was in many ways the jump starting of a new era of left organizing. And meanwhile, the consolidation of power for a lot of folks who already have it. So I think we were trying to really think, how can we avoid the kind of like stimulus that we saw in response to the financial crisis that we saw, where, you know, the bailout of big banks and not of people who were losing their homes, some kind of gestures towards like green jobs and a Green New Deal, but not very much delivery on almost any of that. And most of what we saw in terms of like green stimulus that under the Obama administration was really like subsidies or tax breaks for green tech and for, like green tech capitalism. Some of which like did help develop low, solar panels and things like that, but which certainly did not really get us towards rebuilding the world in the way that we need to do. So we talk about that crisis a little bit in the book and try to, say, well, okay, like we know more crises are coming. Capitalism is a system that periodically goes through crises. And if, now that climate change is becoming increasingly we know climate change is here, and as we see more and more climate crises in terms in the form of extreme weather and disasters and things like that, we're going to see more and more, I think, these different kinds of crises of capitalism coinciding with one another, and we need to like be prepared for those and try to use those to fight back. And I think, we said like, we know worse is coming in the book, and we did not know what kind of worse was coming. So then it was like, oh, okay, well, we weren't actually expecting a global pandemic, but this is also a form of capitalist crises that I think, we can see very much coming out of the ecological transformations that capitalism is instigating, and that then collides with sort of our existing system of under provision of public services and healthcare and things like that. So in any case, that's a long lead up, but we wrote a short kind of like, the piece you're referencing was like trying to build on some of the arguments of the book of like, okay, we need to use these moments and try to push for as we're seeing in this moment of crisis, suddenly a lot of things that were not possible, like spending $2 trillion overnight, become possible when you have these moments of crisis. The $2 trillion stimulus package, the first stimulus package that was passed, that was more than like Joe Biden's entire 10-year climate program. So like money can move when someone decides that it needs to. The how will you pay for argument goes away, all of these things. So I think it's really important to like recognize all of that. And we have been arguing for that we need to use some of this like stimulus spending to keep, obviously to make it possible for people to stay safe, to not work if it's unsafe, and to be able to like continue to survive through that, to have access to healthcare and all of those sorts of things that I think that we're arguing for more broadly, but also to start spending some of that money in a way that would put us on a path to some of the transformation that we need to start decarbonizing our society really quickly. So we've been arguing for that. The problem is, it's obviously very hard to actually, I think, make that happen. And I do feel sort of, this is something that I'm sure we can all talk about, but I think it's a really challenging moment in terms of feeling like we actually have, I think we have the analysis, we have ideas for what we could do, for how we could be doing all of this differently. For like, there's Daniel and Thea worked with a bunch of other scholars and activists on a green stimulus program that would sort of lay out a way to spend a lot of money in a way that would both tackle the climate crisis or tackle the climate crisis in a way that centers justice. And we have, and it's very detailed, like it's very good, they've gone into a lot of detail in a lot of areas. So it's not like we don't have analysis ideas, people who want these things. Like I think through the Sanders campaign, we saw that there are a lot of people who really want the world to be different. But translating all of that into the power to do that, and especially when a lot of our usual sources of power, which are not only elections, but like being out in the streets, like going on strike. There are, obviously movements to organize essential workers and rent strikes and things like that, but it is challenging to figure out how you do a lot of our traditional forms of disruptive activity in the midst of a pandemic. And so I don't have answers to all of that, but I do think it's a really important moment for us to be talking about these things, and also to be like pointing out over and over again, like it's not that we can't do these things, we are choosing not to do them over and over, and like we really that there's a lot we can learn from how we are responding to this crisis. And I think that we are in for certainly many, we still haven't seen sort of like, we're still in the post 2008 moment of political turbulence. This is going to continue on for years and years to come. So I think we have a lot. We should think of like a moment of crisis as being both like a sort of discrete and short period of time, but also a much longer one. And I just realized I've been gesturing too much, which is slowing the speed down. So, but with that, I'll stop and let somebody else jump in.
I think those are good, bold gestures for a bold moment. Sarah, I think you've had some thoughts on kind of the Bernie movement, right? So like and I think in the DSA for Bernie, we talked a lot about like how we're kind of building a movement backwards, right? We're starting from having this transformative figure and then trying to build the mass movement, where usually it's the other way around, right? So I was curious, I know we talked really briefly about that. What are your kind of thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and that was actually something that I was thinking a lot about when I was preparing for this panel and sort of thinking about the question of socialism after Sanders. And one of the things that I thought was that in order to sort of think through like what socialism or like the socialist project looks like after Sanders, it might actually be helpful to think about like the socialist project before Sanders. And I think there could sometimes be a tendency on the organized left in DSA to kind of think of Sanders as like the beginning of a socialist resurgence in the United States, rather than see the way in which Sanders himself kind of emerged, like the possibility of a Sanders campaign really emerged within a context of social movements. As Alyssa pointed out, post 2008 social movements. I'm thinking, of course, of the Indignados in Greece and Spain, obviously Occupy in the United States, the movement for Black Lives, even the first kind of iteration of the education strike wave, which was the Chicago teacher strike in 2012. I think, all of these things kind of laid the basis for the Sanders campaign. And I worry a little bit. I've seen there have been like a few articles that have been published since it became clear that Sanders wasn't going to be able to secure the nomination, that we're kind of trying to caution newly organized socialists not to return to like the movementism of the pre-2016 left. And I feel like, I mean, on the one hand, like I'm thinking of a specific article, there were really good points that were raised about how, prior to Sanders, the organized left had kind of abandoned the state as a terrain of struggle and was, I think, anti-electoral in a way that really alienated us from the majority of people whose understanding and conception of politics is very much rooted in electoral politics. But on the other hand, I think it's really important to remember the way in which these kinds of struggles were able to set the stage for a socialist electoral agenda, and the way in which these types of movements can advance that agenda even when we are able to secure electoral victories, because that is what we will ultimately have to do. So yeah, those are some thoughts about that.
Oh, it was great. Does anyone want to respond to that? Have any kind of other thoughts on that kind of line?
I've got some thoughts, but I want to let others jump in first if they have thoughts. No one? Okay. Yeah, so these conversations are happening a lot, especially around DSA's relationship with the Democrats post-Bernie. And I think we really need to read the writing on the wall. I mean, not only, as was mentioned, we have this global climate change disaster looming, but now we are in this global pandemic. You know, we are facing multiple extremely urgent crises. And still, knowing all this, the Democrats did everything they could to defeat the leftist challenger, even if it meant nominating one of the most conservative members of their party, a rapist, a warmonger with dementia probably, because they would rather lose to Trump and be able to uphold the status quo of the Democratic Party than win. And I know there are some who say we should be trying to take over the Democratic Party, or we should, you know, align with them sometimes and sometimes not. And I just think, you know, that will never happen. They will never allow a takeover of the Democratic Party to happen. It's not run democratically. We can't do it. We shouldn't waste our time. It's a fundraising apparatus. It's a voter turnout apparatus. It does not do any organizing. There's nothing to even take over except maybe a cash vault that, of course, would be taken away from us if we ever were able to take it over. You know, the Democratic Party is where social movements go to die. We all know this. And yet, when we are running DSA candidates on the Democratic Party line, we are funneling people into this failing party by having them register as Democrats. You know, we are actually moving them backwards. When we're canvassing for these candidates who are running as Democrats, and we come across someone who's not registered, that person is actually more politically developed for our purposes than someone who is a registered Democrat. Likely they are not registered as either a Republican or a Democrat because they don't see a difference between the two major parties when it comes down to it. You know, they are already ripe for socialism right there. And that is more of a systemic analysis than even some liberals have. Like, they already feel like an inclination that the system is rigged against them. And we should be using that. But by registering them as a Democrat, we're actually moving them backwards politically. And simultaneously, we're working to rehabilitate this party that we all hate, that hates us, that's going to stab us in the back. And it doesn't make sense as a strategy anymore. And I think it is time for our party of our own. And I don't mean like we need a third party. I don't even want to use the term third party because that's not really the concept that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like what the Green Party is doing. I'm not talking about running Bernie Sanders on a third party ticket. We can't be pie in the sky and think we can just like snap our fingers, you know, we can call a convention in a year and with a couple thousand people, we'll have a new national party. I think we need to start small. We need to start local. And with COVID, I think there's going to be even more support and like necessity for this type of initiative, because not only is one of the most vile people in the Democratic Party now their leader, but as was mentioned, they've shown us that everything they've told us that is impossible for so long was a lie. And people are realizing this because of COVID. You know, these trillions of dollars of bailouts, working people are lucky to get a $1,200 check. Now is the time to leave this failing party and stake our claim to organized politics in the US. And one more thing, I just want to read a quote from a congressional report. Let me pull it up. You might have seen this, I think it was on Twitter, but it was describing the Communist Party of the 1930s. And it says, a full-time organization. American political parties are usually active during election campaigns. Their primary function is to elect this or that candidate to office. Between campaigns, activity is at a low ebb. The Communist Party functions at all times of the year, every day of the week, and at all hours of the day. It is a full-time organization which is not restricted to election campaigns. It persistently seeks to permeate every phase of American life for its own subversive purpose. Communist agents may be found wherever and whenever there is an opportunity for communist propaganda or the promotion of civil strife, whether it be the factory, the union, the church, the school, or the neighborhood. So that is what I mean when I talk about forming party. I don't just mean a ballot line. I mean a full-time organization. And DSA is uniquely set up for this already because this is already essentially how we function. We are already in the workplace. We are in the community in a way that these other, you know, traditional third-party efforts are not. And we have to start laying the groundwork. People say, you know, we want to get to a workers' party someday. If we want to do that, we have to start laying the groundwork today. And I have tons more thoughts about this, but I'll let other people talk.
That was very well put. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
All I All I know is on that question, I always agree with the last opinion I heard. So I currently agree with that one.
I think that was a really good point, especially about the quote about the Communist Party. I recently read The Romance of American Communism, which Verso just reissued, and it's actually very inspirational. I mean, it's in a lot of ways very sad, but just the energy they had and just the totality of their view of society. That there was always an opportunity for struggle, and how much they actually achieved, I think is kind of, in some ways, kind of like you said, Olivia, kind of DSA is uniquely positioned to do that. So I think that is kind of exciting. One thing you mentioned is kind of being active in the schools. And Nick, I know that you recently, sorry, I just lost my audio. But Nick, I know you've been a little active in that space as well. You recently returned the UCSC Chancellor's Achievement Award for Diversity in solidarity with the striking grad students. Do you want to talk a little bit about what kind of that activism in the sphere of the school looks like?
Sure, and I'm really happy to be on this panel with everyone, and I'm really appreciating the conversation thus far. So yeah, I did this kind of odd gesture that was semi-spontaneous, that came in a moment of looking for some meaningful leverage of what could be put to give some force and some kind of faculty voice to the cost of living adjustment strike by graduate students and undergraduate students and other campus workers at UC Santa Cruz. So one of the things that I realized was just that how much of university labor currently relies on unwaged labor and what I would call exploited labor by students of color, who both are expected to represent the institution's commitment to diversity, to do recruitment work of other students of color in order to make the university less violent, so the university itself can claim them statistically. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I've been trying to work out what this would mean as an organizing strategy, was to think about what would it look like to have a diversity strike. In other words, to think about that diversity labor as labor, and therefore as labor that can be withdrawn, leveraged, put in conversation with, and used as a means of both building a movement and building links with other movements. I think about what it would look like for Black students organizations, for undocumented students organizations that the university likes to advertise, likes to put on promotional materials, to be able to actively use the university's desire to represent them as a means of political force building. And so I kind of returned the university's diversity award in the spirit of that. I thought it could be one useful gesture in thinking through matters in that way. But I think that, one of the difficult things I think about doing solidarity work from a faculty perspective is that you run into the fact that faculty oftentimes want to imagine that they are the experts in movements when they are oftentimes the least, the most poorly positioned to understand that which their students are organizing for. And so there's this desire to both be the expert when they are the least capable of listening. And so I think that offered me an instance to kind of try and rethink about what my position as faculty strategically means when we're talking about university-led struggles. Just about some of the previous points about the relationship between this moment and the 2008 moment. I think it's hard to figure out where we are vis-a-vis that moment, but it's important to have some strategic understanding of it, because just in moments the post-COVID moment, however long that's going to be, however far we are from it, is likely going to be a moment where there's increasing pressure on universities to absorb the large numbers of people who no longer have jobs and stabilize their lives through access to debt. In 2008, the best response that, or maybe we could call it a means of coalition building between leftists and liberals, became a call for a return to tuition-free public universities. And I would really try and urge some caution, both as a university historian who, you know, who just doesn't quite understand what people are talking about when they're talking about a return to the times of free tuition. Like, are we talking about returning to the Cold War? Like, are we talking about turning to the height of McCarthyism? Or are we talking about that like 5-year period between which like the Civil Rights Act happened and Reagan basically abolished free tuition at the University of California, which was also the height of COINTELPRO. So the idea of this kind of nostalgic for a moment in university history when tuition was free doesn't really think that carefully about how much that free tuition was a tax and a means of building counterinsurgent strategy against the left. So when we're thinking about that, it's not just about thinking through the question of university tuition, it's about what kinds of linkages that free university tuition can come along with, which means that we really need to be better historians of universities and also to have an actual theory of what the university is that responds to movements within the university, that takes those movements as the prime theorist of what the university is. And I don't just mean student movements. I mean like thinking that the authority on universities comes as much from what custodial workers do as it does from what professors do. And since professors' theories of the universities that oftentimes are the most centered, maybe we actually would learn a lot more from non-academic staff when we're thinking about what a university is. So just a couple notes in thinking about how we can use the university as leverage in moving forward into different modalities of struggle.
That was great. I think, oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, as somebody who spent many years organizing a grad student union, I thank you, Nick, for returning the award. It's really like actually, I think, something, it's actually very meaningful to hear about faculty, when faculty are like actually taking seriously their own position and doing that kind of analytical work and standing in solidarity with movements. And so, it really, I think it's really, I completely agree with pretty much everything you've just said. And I think what you're saying about I think it will be interesting to see whether the wave of, I think, organizing that's happened in a lot of ways on campuses since 2008 starts to shift the way that faculty and others are thinking about this moment and the sort of post-COVID moment. And I'm feeling at least some tendrils of hope in that regard, which may be misplaced, and that it does seem that the sort of the realization amongst some faculty that like this is really that in some ways like the future of any university looks threatened is maybe shaking some people out of complacency. But I really do. I think that we have a lot of work to do to theorize like what the university, the place of the university is in so many ways of like what kinds, like what are people, what kinds of work people do, what the university's role in like cities is in terms of transforming, gentrifying. Obviously, a lot of the COLA work has been around the sort of rising cost of living and impossibility of living in a really expensive part of the world for everyone from students to staff. And I was always really grateful that our organizing campaign, we were in the same union as the other workers on campus. And I think that's really rare, but very important for like bringing different kinds of workers together and reminding us that like we do share a position of antagonism towards our employer, and that's what they are, an employer. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about universities all day. I will not make everyone do that, but I do think there's a lot of, I think they're often overlooked how important universities are in sort of as connectors of a lot of different parts of the economy, and also the ways that they're involved in real estate. They're involved in, like eds and meds. They have hospitals that are sort of, an arm of the university that are also like, often they're like not for profit, but in the same way as other not-for-profit hospitals that are taking private insurance and so on. They are, involved in a lot of, they have many arms and tentacles that go far beyond like the campus. So I completely agree that it's a really important thing to be thinking about and like thinking about seriously as we're moving forward.
I would actually be interested to ask Nick a question about whether or not you've seen what might be perceived as like the threat to public education as a consequence of COVID, whether you've seen faculty organizing, if there's been an uptick in faculty organizing. Also, it should be said that Nick was on the picket line almost every day of the COLA strike and is a legend. Okay.
Well, I can't, it's hard for me to speak for much, like beyond what I see. And I think on the Santa Cruz faculty end, we haven't stopped organizing. And we also are, I mean, there's a very kind of particular example having seen the COLA movement really gain steam and move to several campuses right at the very moment when the campuses got closed by COVID. So like dealing with the aftershocks of that, and also dealing with the fact that Santa Cruz it's declared student discipline an essential service. Effectively. And because of that, it's continued student disciplinary hearings. It's continued going after students who were engaged in activism of various shades during the winter quarter. And so that's kept faculty organized in some way, but also it's completely sapped some of our energy, because the university, instead of actually thinking in the big picture, our day-to-day lives are completely consumed with trying to manage the university's continued counterinsurgency against what was the Wildcat strike.
That's awesome. So actually, Olivia, I'm kind of curious for your take. So, historically the socialist movement has kind of found a lot of activity, as we're seeing now in universities and in kind of youth-oriented spaces. So the Democratic Socialists of America has kind of a youth wing, as it were, the Young Democratic Socialists of America. So I'm kind of curious, as a chapter leader, I'm kind of curious how you see organizations like YDSA and these kind of student organizations that are kind of coming back to campus. What do you see their role in this struggle?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of student worker movements that some of our members are increasingly involved in. I also, actually most of what I do in DSA has to do with anti-imperialist and Palestine work. So when I think about campuses, I think about all the potential for student activists to end their university's complicity in these oppressive systems that we're fighting against. Universities have these massive endowments that are invested in Raytheon, invested in all these terrible companies. They do these research partnerships with like Elbit, this Israeli weapons company. They do recruiting for for Boeing, for Lockheed Martin, they are very complicit in the military industrial complex, in the prison industrial complex, in the fossil fuel industry. And an immediate step that campus activists can work towards right now is ending their university's complicity in these systems. So you see Students for Justice in Palestine working with YDSA chapters and working with other divestment groups to bring these like broad intersectional divestment resolutions. And I think doing those and making them more hard-hitting, going after where the money is and who's in charge of the money will help make an immediate impact in ending university complicity in these systems.
I think that's a really important point. And I think, Jeremy, if we can hop across the pond briefly, I think the last time I heard a lot about UK student activism and conflict there is a lot of, issues with tuition increases being levied. What's kind of the state of organizing in UK universities?
Well, there's no student organization and there's no serious student mobilization, but faculty mobilization is in a completely different historic phase to what it's been historically, because we have a national union, which covers all faculty at every level. And it's very difficult to make any meaningful comparisons between the American and British sectors. The history is so different and the kind of differentiation of resources is so different. But mainly, the main thing that's happened over the past 5 years within the sector has been effectively, governments have been trying since the beginning of the Blair government. They've been trying to sort of impose kind of neoliberal logics on the sector, and also to impose a kind of hierarchization. Because actually, what actually happened in the early 90s is, for very contingent historical reasons, so there was a kind of de-hierarchization of the sector, because you had a conservative government which, just for contingent historical reasons, had very little commitment to the historic elite institutions. And then Blair government basically wanted to restore the authority of the historic elite, and they didn't like that they'd accidentally created a system that gave people like me academic careers. And so they've basically been trying for the past 20 years to create a kind of, firstly to create a kind of hierarchy and create a kind of institutional elite modeled on the Ivy League, and to institute kind of really aggressive marketization, aggressive kind of liberalizations to really, to try and reinforce that process. And that's had really dramatic effects on over the past 5 years. That's really created a situation where, student debt is still nothing on the scale of the states, and the systems by which student debt has to be repaid are not nearly as kind of punitive as they are in the states. So it's not really comparable, although historically it's still a relatively new experience. People to have the levels of student debt that they do. But the main mobilization is around the fact that lots of universities have been restructuring, faculty have been being made redundant, and what is completely comparable to the situation in the States and in France and in some other countries is the massive casualization, and the fact that huge amounts of work is being done by by casualized staff, by area staff, by people who don't have who aren't being paid well, don't have good contracts. But I would say, I wouldn't want to idealize the situation, but we don't have a kind of highly protected elite professoriate in the UK like there is in the States. Tenure was formally abolished by Thatcher in the 80s as an institution, so it doesn't really exist. So there's very high levels of solidarity, but very high levels of solidarity between students and faculty, and historically sort of unprecedented levels of militancy and solidarity across the faculty, across the workforce. The problem is that ultimately employees in public universities, and all British universities are effectively public. They have an odd status, they're effectively public, don't have a lot of social leverage. There's not a lot we can do. Nobody really gives a fuck if British university, if professors and students and staff all just stop working and refuse to, participate in the process. Nobody cares. There isn't really any leverage. So it's been very difficult. It's very difficult to kind of win any sort of significant gains outside of a bigger political process. And that is a problem, you know, and it's a problem which speaks to the problem of the whole problem of socialist organizing and labor organizing, you know, in a global context in which the sectors in which the working, you know, workers have traditionally been able to exercise the most leverage, like manufacturing, like just don't exist like where we are. You know, they're in a completely different part of the planet now. And it is a problem, and it's a challenge, and I think it's really, on some level, you know, it's a major problem that the you know, that the socialist movement in the States has come up against already, that it's very difficult. You know, that it's very difficult to replicate the forms of leverage which it was possible for labor organization to exercise when we had high concentrations of manufacturing industry in these countries. So I mean, how we do it, I'm not entirely sure, though my suspicion is that really what needs to happen, and what happened in both contexts, is the continued effort to build solidarity right across the whole education sector. Because the one thing we have seen, like over the past sort of 5 years, the one thing we have seen, and it is the real kind of, you know, significant success that some people have already referred to, has been the radicalization of teachers, of school teachers in at least some parts of the States. And school teachers can exercise leverage when they're sufficiently solid, and when they've got the support of the community. And I think I mean, I think the sort of, you know, it's a key strategic task for the left in the UK, which hasn't really thought about at all, is the fact that our school teachers, I mean, average school teachers in the UK are sort of liberal left in their kind of intuitive politics, but they're not militant. Historically, the sector is fragmented in a way that the higher education sector is no longer fragmented. And they're not really, and the level of political consciousness is really weak, especially amongst younger teachers. I mean, the average teacher kind of is aware of being subject to neoliberalizing pressures and hates it, but they don't have a systematic critique of it, or they have no systematic critique of what's happening to them at all. We haven't really seen any equivalent of the sort of West Virginia, Chicago, sort of California mobilizations here. But I would also say in the States, I mean, my casual perception is that really it's a really urgent task to extend those, because really, you know, I mean, ultimately, you know, I might be wrong about this, but my guess is, you know, the places where the kind of support for Bernie getting the nomination collapsed, you know, in the face of a kind of, you know, panic and a sort of, you know, running to Biden as a safe candidate, was places where you haven't actually got the levels of militancy amongst those kind of social layers, the kind of, you know, proletarianized professionals who in the urban centers and in a few places of historic militancy like Virginia have been mobilized and have been radicalized. But in a lot of places that hasn't really happened on the scale I think it would have to happen for that kind of you know, pressure to be brought to bear. So I mean, whether that's through the Democratic Party or whether it's through DSA or whatever the vehicle, I think, you know, it seems to me that is a really kind of urgent task. But obviously, the situation, as I say, the situation is really, I mean, the real difference between the American and British situation is that we don't have, you know, what we do have, at least in the HE sector, is we have a solid union. It's a very high union density. We have one union which represents the entire, everybody from kind of, you know, grad students to senior professors, and, you know, that is, you know, that's something, you know, that is some comfort.
Very interesting perspective. I think, yeah, I think you in your book, and I think several other people have mentioned kind of the one of the key things in getting and building a big socialist movement and kind of pushing for that is going to be the unions. Some of what, you know, there's a wide variety in the militancy of at least, you know, in the U.S. and the different unions. So I'm kind of curious for, you know, people's perspectives on how do we reorient our unions away from kind of the old kind of conservatism that a lot of these unions have, and towards kind of this more militant, active, and socialist unions. Any thoughts there?
Well, I'll just say, I don't know if I have an answer to that exactly, but you know, I think one of the things that Jeremy's comments bring up for me is like I think there's been a lot of conversation post in the aftermath of the primaries about like how a recognition that it would be really difficult to kind of like go from like nothing to like winning the presidency as a socialist, or for somebody who like is a self-proclaimed, that you can kind of like leapfrog all of this other kinds of stages of what we think of like stages of political building or development or whatever. And that is actually quite hard to imagine that happening absent a really strong labor movement, or like something like a CP-like, organization or whatever you might imagine that is like able to, provide some of that institutional support and some of that like, like political education and things like that, that can actually firm up support for a candidate rather than make people feel like, that can really just like build a real movement. And I think it was totally worth trying. It's like it takes a really long time to build all of that. And the kind of, I think in the aftermath, I think we've recognized like, okay, so like that was worth a shot. We still have to do a lot of that building, but it is really, I think it's really tricky because it's also, it's obviously like these things are related, and it's not like you can just say, okay, well now we build like the socialist labor movement or whatever. And, I think it's important to both be critical of a lot of the conservative tendencies of unions and also to like recognize where that comes from. And that often is just, it's defensive, like unions have been getting their asses kicked in the US for a long time. And so they adopt more and more, I think, are more likely to adopt a defensive strategy than to like go out on a limb for, like pro-labor left-wing candidates. And we saw this really in 2016. And it was, I think it's actually interesting to see that there were a lot more endorsements of Bernie from unions, especially like in California and on the West Coast. Like there were several, I organized with Unite Here, and this time there was obviously like kind of like controversy over the culinary workers union in Las Vegas, and the kind of like, which did not endorse anyone, but like whether or not they were suggesting that Bernie was going to take away Medicare for all, would take away workers' healthcare, which itself was, I think, an illustration of both like that kind of conservative defensive tendency of like, we need to protect this like really good healthcare we've won for these, low wage service workers, or people who would otherwise be low wage service workers who have good wages and benefits because of the union, but who by sort of like playing that defensive game are also, losing a chance to elect somebody who would improve conditions and healthcare access for a lot of their other workers who don't have healthcare, because a lot of, workers represented by Unite Here elsewhere who are like hotel housekeepers or whatever may not have that kind of benefits. And it's like very like partial. Anyway, the point is, I think we're starting to see a lot of unions move and try to take bolder positions, but, then they also, some of them probably are feeling like a little burned by that. Like they went out for Bernie and then now they're going to have to get behind Biden. Is that going to like burn bridges within the Democratic Party, whatever. So I guess it's like all to say, like, it's really hard. And I remember having a bunch of arguments with people, like staff organizers in 2016 about why Unite Here should endorse Bernie. And like, people would be like, we're not going to do that. It's not going to happen. And I was like, why? This should definitely happen. And I still think, I still obviously think that like, it would be better for unions to like kind of collectively realize that they need to throw in for like pushing left rather than continually to each make decisions defensively on their own. But I also recognize that there are a lot of real reasons why they aren't doing that. And that is going to take a lot of change. And but the militancy of workers in these sectors, I think, is really exciting. Like seeing, Jeremy was mentioning teacher strikes, but seeing like service sector workers get more militant and more organized. Like I think all of these things are going to also like change the unions that are representing those workers. And there is some, I guess the question is like, what role do socialists play? Obviously the sort of like, Olivia was talking about the CP, and there's obviously kind of like, or there's like a vision of like the CP as going into industry and organizing and being part of like the CIO and it's sort of like glory days and things like that. And I definitely think that socialists and those on the left should be involved in organizing labor and in unions and things like that. But, I also just want to recognize that it will probably take, it's going to be like a long and slow process, and that like, the thing that I think is tricky too is like how do you relate that kind of like base building or union, like building the labor movement, building up unions and so on, to like the kind of question of electoral politics in the state, because they are really imbricated and it's really hard to separate them out. And you know, like my own experience of like when I was organizing the grad student union, I was kind of like ignoring electoral politics except for like very instrumentally, because I was like, we're going to organize the union, like I'm not paying attention to the primaries, whatever. And then like I was not even, you know, like Trump wins, that completely changed the terrain on which we were trying to organize our own union. Like, I mean, whatever, this is a basic point, but these kinds of things can really, it's just, you know, like you can't completely ignore the kinds of electoral questions, because that has so much to do with like what the terrain for labor is, like with labor law, with like the NLRB, with all of these state institutions that are already very much arrayed against workers organizing, and that will become more so, and that are becoming more so. And so it's, you know, that's not an answer. I guess it's just like, here are all of the reasons why I think a lot of this is really tough. And I'm curious, you know, maybe I'm curious of like you know, Olivia or other folks who have been doing, you know, thinking about this stuff from like the perspective of DSA, or like how explicitly socialist organizations relate to unions. Because I think most of my experience like probably comes from the other way around, of like being a leftist in a union and both being frustrated and also trying to like get what's going on there.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the question of engaging in the electoral sphere and how that relates to unions, first, like with this concept of, you know, a full-time organization as a party, when we have our own candidates running, you know, as our own party, we can have these candidates be drawing attention to the party activities that include labor organizing, that include building community within the party and outside of it. You know, that's what I mean by a real full-time organization. The candidates and the electoral strategy would be part of building out the mass movement, not funneling people into the failing Democratic Party. And in Portland DSA right now, we do have a robust labor working group that they do like salting fairs. So they'll have people who are looking for jobs come talk to workers who are trying to organize their workplaces, and they'll place them in these workplaces sometimes. I think we placed something like 35 workplaces where we have salts. And obviously not all those are going to become active organizing campaigns, but it's a really cool project to see happening. We're doing some work within the Amazon warehouses here as well. I also want to point to the IWW in Portland is doing an amazing job. They organized the first fast food union in the country, the Burgerville Workers Union. They are organizing food service workers all across Portland at many different shops. And these are campaigns that the bigger unions would typically turn their nose up at. They wouldn't help them. And they are using their power in these campaigns to win immediate demands. So not only, yes, they are fighting for contract negotiations, but they're also showing their coworkers again and again, you know, what they can win immediately when they demand it together. So when they walk off the job, which they did at Burgerville, which they did at Little Big Union, which they did at Voodoo Donuts recently, you know, the contract isn't really the win. It's the power. It's the friends we made along the way. You know, it's the power you build with your fellow workers as a collective. You show them that is where your power is. You know, most of the IWW folks, none of them are paid union staffers. You know, they're working class volunteers who are very much invested in this as workers and who are not beholden to some, you know, overarching bureaucratic union structure or worried about, you know, offending some liberal elected official. I think what the IWW is doing in Portland is a really cool model that we could definitely learn from as socialist organizers.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, Olivia, about you know, collective action being the basis for worker power and not necessarily the contract, which like isn't to say that you shouldn't struggle for a contract, but you know, really centering collective action as like the basis for your ability to even enforce that contract once you win it, I think is key. And I guess I just wanted to say two things on this point. So unions are important. I'm a union member. I, you know, recently participated and was deeply involved in the wildcat strike that happened at UCSC and was starting to spread to other campuses. I think 2 points I think are important to keep in mind here. The first is that most workers in the United States are not unionized. They don't belong to unions. But this doesn't have to be a barrier to collective action and to, you know, building and exerting worker power. And I think this is something that we're seeing a lot in the COVID era in terms of workers who are taking collective action and are organizing together without either without the help of you know, the union officialdom or without any type of union infrastructure to draw on at all. And I think the other thing that I wanted to say is that I think for most workers who belong to unions, I think the reality is that these workers themselves are not organized in a way that I think could allow them to push back on some of the conservative tendencies that you described, Hannah. And this is really consistent with our experience in Santa Cruz and with the wildcat strike, where once we started you know, organizing and taking collective action, we were actually able to push our union leadership to demand to bargain with the university over housing, to file charges against the university for how they were disciplining and responding to wildcat strikers, and to really make cost of living, you know, a center point of every piece of, you know, correspondence that they were sending out after the wildcat strike had began. So yeah, I think, you know, our ability to push back against these types of conservative tendencies really lies in our ability to you know, be organized ourselves and engage in collective action together.
Nick, I saw you nodding along for a lot of that. Do you have
Yeah,
anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I think the idea of collective action as a basis for worker power is a really important one. Just, you know, like anecdotally from the strike, we were a lot of the faculty who were involved in organizing were surprised when a couple of folks had conversations with faculty who no one ever saw on the picket line. Like no one ever no one ever thought of them as leftists. But it turned out in conversation that these faculty, a surprising number of faculty were willing to strike. And so like if it's not just about like thinking about collective action as a basis for building power also means that you move away from some presumptions about identity and even focusing on what is an action that people are willing to get involved in, and the willingness to show up in different ways is one way of imagining what capacity is. And I think that goes back to the question about, you know, the question I began with about the diversity strike, which is just that, you know, in a lot of contexts, the ways in which people are transfer points for the extraction of legitimacy is not as workers, but like it's through their relationship to institutions. So, you know, there are ways in which, you know, ways to get students mobilized as potential workers. And I think actually a good long-term left project is to think about how we can actually start constructing our students as workers and think about what of the possibility of a wages for students campaign beyond just asking for free tuition, not beyond just asking for you know, students not to get charged to labor wagelessly, but asking for them to actually get paid. But thinking about the way that students figure into systems as transfer points for different kinds of capital relations between the federal government and the university, between the federal government and the state, all the financial aid programs which use students, but students never see the money that passes through the kind of interface that is their social security number and their application for student aid, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all things that can be leveraged if given the right kind of basis for collective action. And I think sometimes asking people to think of themselves as workers, as a collective identity can be useful, but oftentimes it's other ways of bringing them into a struggle for collective action that I think, yeah, is a way for building a different kind of base for struggle.
That's awesome. I think it's a very radical statement. I think to say, you know, I think it's great to think of students, you know, as a wage for students, as workers, instead of just. I think we're so conditioned to see ourselves as consumers above all else, right? Where I think, and Jeremy, you wrote a bit about this in your book of kind of how everything. I think I have a quote here actually, conveniently. You have a really good quote here about everything from basic mineral resources to our ability to form relationships with other humans is now subject to the capitalist logic of commodification. You know, it's like these, you know, the university system, they're seeing students as like commodities. All of our social relationships to a certain extent have become kind of a commodity where, you know, you're not getting drinks with friends anymore. You're networking, right? You're building your future endeavors. So I'm kind of curious, like, what does it look like to decommodify our interactions? How do we achieve that?
Well, I mean, actually, the way Nick framed it is an interesting example, an interesting way of thinking about that question, actually, because I think the way you're problematizing the assumption that for example, he was both introducing but also problematizing the idea that students as workers is the way to do it, because students as workers is not a new idea. I mean, students as workers has been a slogan of student movements going back to the 60s. And for me, historically, I mean, this, you know, I've been teaching these kinds of ideas to students since the mid-90s, and it's not that persuasive telling students that they're workers, because it's not really what they're doing. It's much more persuasive usually to talk about what does it mean to be a student. A student is someone who studies, and actually what the real kind of problem for students especially under kind of neoliberal systems is they're not given the opportunity to study. They're interpreted as consumers. They're interpreted as future employees who are supposed to be collecting a set of skills, but they're actually not enabled in any meaningful way to study. And actually, I think, and partly what it means to decommodify education is, to some extent, that's an example, is to give people the opportunity to engage in that, in the process of education on terms which, to some extent, I mean, you know, which are just kind of self-evident to most people. It's self-evident to most people, you know, even people with no political education, that education is not a process that can be conceptualized as a retail transaction in any meaningful way. And it can't be conceptualized. I mean, and this goes back to like ancient times. Like almost anyone who's thought about it recognizes that it's an education, that schooling is a collaborative process, that the outcomes which anybody might want from education are based on a kind of cooperative exercise. And so there's a real kind of, there's an immediate kind of, you know, tension between that and any sort of instrumentalization of it and any kind of commodification of it. So I think that is one way of doing it. I mean, the other thing I would say about students as workers, actually, just an aside, I mean, the other problem for me with conceptualizing the actual, you know, the role of the student as workers is that very often lots of students are actually workers as well as being students. And certainly in the UK, I mean, it's, you know, it's something some of us have kind of banged our heads against the wall for the past 30 years, trying to persuade unions to take seriously actually organizing students as work who actually work, you know, because students, in every UK city, the entire kind of catering, the entire kind of catering large sections of the catering and retail industry would collapse if students withdrew their labour. Students weren't willing to work for very low wages to support themselves through their studies. And there's a massive class differential in students who have to do that, who have to spend a lot of their time in wage labour, and those who don't, like during their studies. And has a huge effect on outcomes and on their experience. And so actually, I think the problem with saying that a student is a worker because they're a student is that it distracts from the fact that lots of students are actually workers because they're workers. And that's a really important site of organization. So what does it mean? And I think you can make an analogy with all kinds of other areas that we want to decommodify, that to some extent, you know, this is an old feature of, you know, it's not by no means a unique observation of mine that capitalism, you know, commodifies everything. And it's not a unique observation either, that the effect of capitalism's tendency to commodify every area of social life is a sort of flattening, is to kind of destroy the uniqueness of everything. So, you know, every type of relationship ends up being modeled on a retail transaction, like rather than have, you know, the student-teacher relationship or the student-student relationship or the doctor-patient relationship or the, you know, the relationship between parents or children and carers, you know, all become exactly the same type of relationship. So partly what it means to decommodify is to recover something of the specificity of relationships and the kind of creative potential inherent in the specificity of those types of relationships, and to sort of demand the right to them. And I would say, I mean, I would sort of think, and I do think that isn't just a kind of poetic observation. I mean, my casual experience is that that's something that has a very immediate resonance with people who have no real politics. Now, even people who are sort of liberal conservatives, really, if you say to them, look, don't you want to let teachers teach? Don't you want to let kids be kids? You know, don't you want to let parents be parents? Then they do, you know, very often people do have a kind of intuitive sense that there's something wrong with the capitalist imposition of this commodifying grid on all of those relationships. So that would be part of my answer. That would be part of what it would mean, but I'm sure other people can have other observations.
I kind of have a question, which is how to think about, 'cause I think all of that makes a lot of sense, and I really like your emphasis. Sorry. Okay, sorry, I thought I had unmuted myself, but I didn't twice. Okay, so what I was saying is I actually have a question that sort of follows up on that. And I really like what you're saying about, about very much of this, and especially the like specificity of relationships and the way that that we, by decommodifying relationships, we can let them be sort of like actual relationships between people. And that those will take different forms depending on like what the nature of the activity is and things like that. But one thing I wonder is how far, I guess, like how, and this is maybe another place to connect things like student organizing to worker organizing, but you know, if you have that kind of like specificity of relationship within the educational experience, but then you know that after that you leave and you like are thrust into the like fully commodified world of, you know, you like descend into the hidden abode of you have to sell your labor power or whatever, and you have no that you're going to have to do that eventually, then surely that, I think that we see the ways that like makes students think about like, okay, well, I have to get a degree that I can like, you know, get a good job with, or I can't study what I want. I need to study what I can like, you know, what will make me a valuable worker. I need to like increase my human capital. I need to do all of these things in a way that is, you know, like totally rational, and that they are assessing the world beyond sort of like that educational relationship, and trying to make a decision about how they can be like able to get, you know, to get a job that will pay off their student loans, especially as like student loan debt increases here in the US, but like that they're and you know, to some degree, like maybe if you had less, maybe if student debt wasn't as big a problem, people would feel like, well, maybe I'll get a job that will pay me a little less, but like I won't have to be like, you know, crushed by my loans forever, or whatever it may be. But I guess I'm curious how you've thought about like what happens when you leave that sphere of like decommodification and enter into the rest of the world, which remains commodified, which is also a long-standing problem, obviously, that we've, you know, had to think about in different ways at different points in history.
What, you asking me?
Anyone who wants to answer, but I thought I'd ask you since I you know.
Well, I would
started,
say, well, okay. I mean, yeah, you raise an important point, and I would sort of say that the scenario, in terms of the specific question of, you know, radicalizing students and the student experience, that what you're describing just sort of confirms what I'm saying. You're describing a situation in which, you know, neoliberalism and the the absence, the contraction of any kind of the decommodified sphere outside, very specific, institutional sectors, puts a pressure on people's experience, in the university. People, I mean, I think the first thing to say to people is you should not have to be making those calculations. You should not have to be, spending all your time at university worrying about what's going to happen afterwards. Now, that shouldn't be what it's like. That's not the kind of historic ideal, which the university holds out. And it's a form of, now, of course, that's not to alter, that doesn't alter the fact that people are going to, that doesn't preclude also pointing out that, and that the labour market is always a site of exploitation, and always a site of the exploitation of labour, and that people are going to be sort of exploited. And it doesn't preclude class consciousness. The fact that every relationship and every mode of site of oppression doesn't have to be conceptualized solely in terms of class relations. It doesn't preclude class consciousness. I think they don't have to be seen as mutually exclusive. I think they can be mutually reinforcing. So I would say that's what I would say. I mean, I would say you can, but I think we have to be wary. I mean, I think, and this is something I sort of talk about in the book a little bit, actually, that we do have to be wary rhetorically, I think, of presenting capitalism as a sort of total system from which there's no escape short of absolute revolution. Because on the one hand, apart from anything else, effectively, that just makes people depressed. It doesn't mobilize people. But also, it's just analytically not very helpful. It's analytically, and politically, I was thinking more helpful to point out that capitalism is constantly trying to, parasitize social relations which are not inherently capitalist in themselves. And for me, that's the kind of what you're describing, the scene you're describing. What's most pedagogically useful for me is to point out the tension. The fact that students are constantly having to live this kind of double consciousness or triple consciousness, to live this contradiction of trying to actually do something which capitalism doesn't want them actually to do, which is just to study and to learn stuff and to become like more creative and capable people in the world, and also to become attractive on the to become human capital for the job market. And you can't, and it's the tension between those things, I think, which is really resolvable. I mean, you're right, and of course, I mean, the problem, of course, partly what you're drawing attention to was always a historic problem for the progressive education movement, even at its height, so in the 50s and 60s, which was, well, we basically wanted to prepare students for a sort of social democratic world when you didn't really have one out there in the world, and to quite the same extent. Well, that's the war of position, baby. Everything is partial, and there is always going to be a tension between. There's always going to be a tension between telling people that this is how you should be a good human being, and this is how you should be an effective economic agent in a capitalist society. And I think that, for me, personally, the thing is just to be as explicit about that as possible. Is to say, look, this is what you should do. If you just want to know how to get a job, if you just want to know what's going to get the money, these are the things you'll need to do. I don't think it's very helpful, I don't think it's helpful, like as a teacher in a university, to try to sort of pretend that the utopian space of the seminar room is protected from the outside world. But that doesn't mean you have to kind of uncritically reproduce the set of capitalist norms either. So you have to sort of try to do both. All of this is also, it's also worth saying, because nobody said it today. I remain, as I have been for the past sort of 10 years, slightly skeptical that saving the university is an achievable goal in the current phase of the current phase of capitalism. That that in the knowledge economy and in the platform economy, actually what universities do is so central to cycles of capital accumulation. They're not going to let us have it. They let us have it for a bit in the middle of the 20th century because it just wasn't that important. It wasn't that important to the way in which they accumulated capital, what people did for 3 years at college. Like now it's too important. So we probably are going to have to go on building our own kind of institutions and our own systems of knowledge production, which historically radical movements and the workers' movements have had to do for most of their history. And I think this does speak to sort of some of Nick's comments. That there's a certain, it's a nostalgia for a certain social democratic ideal of the university and a liberal social democratic ideal of the university, which I always use exactly the same formulation. It existed for 5 years. It was there for 5, basically. Is good. It serves a useful rhetorical purpose a lot of the time, but it's also, I think, I think at the same time that we have to do what we can to defend the university and to extend it. I mean, maybe that's the case. I mean, actually, even as I say that, though, do I really believe? I don't know, because there are places where that's sort of been disproven. So in Germany and Chile, for example, there have been, mass action has actually reversed like neoliberalization in the university. So maybe I'm overly pessimistic, but I do think we have to pay attention to the importance of creating our own institutions of knowledge production, because they definitely they're not gonna hand over like Harvard to us, and they're not going to do that.
Any thoughts on that? Any responses?
I was just going to say one of the things that's very interesting. I mean, on the last point, I agree with a lot of that. And sorry, I just put you on the spot of being like, explain how we think about like the commodification of education in relation to all other forms of commodification. And I think that pointing to the tensions seems really important as like both a pedagogical tool within the classroom, but also in general, of showing the tensions between what we want and what capital wants, and where those hit up against one another, I think is always extremely instructive. But it's been interesting to see, doing this postdoc at Harvard and seeing like their rhetoric around things like the endowment, which they describe as like cuts for the present are intergenerational justice, which I find particularly kind of like offensive as like a person who works on climate stuff. And they won't like divest from fossil fuels, but they'll talk about like how they need to cut the budget now, like lay off staff, like cut benefits, all of these things to preserve the endowment basically in perpetuity. Because I think places like Harvard think of themselves as like they will outlast like the United States, they will outlast like whatever they are global institutions for like that have a vision of themselves as like lasting forever, and they definitely do not give a shit what the people organizing within them want to do. And that is, I think, figuring out like how to still try to like work around the edges and places like that, while also building our own spaces, I think is going to be crucial, especially because I think this next wave is going to be really brutal on like the job landscape of academia, which still has not recovered from 2008.
So Sarah, I think you're kind of uniquely positioned here as being a grad student, but also a platform worker, since you drive for Lyft and deliver, or a door dasher, I guess is the word. So I'm kind of curious for this. The platform workers have kind of taken on a new prominence in our economy, especially now that some of them are considered, I guess, essential workers. So I'm curious for what's your take on the scope of what's going on there? What are there organizing opportunities? What's it like being an essential feature of our economy right now?
So yeah, I actually haven't driven in quite some time. I drove for Lyft for almost 3 years, and then I was driving for DoorDash for about a year. Part of that started before I was in graduate school, and it really, I started driving for the same reason that a lot of people start driving, which is that I couldn't find any other work. And then I continued to drive when I, started graduate school here at Santa Cruz. And I decided I found the form of work really interesting. And so I decided that I was going to do ethnographic research. And actually the last few months I've been conducting interviews with other platform mediated workers since the shelter in place began, which has been really interesting, I think, for a variety of reasons. So on the one hand, you have drivers who are working for companies like Lyft and Uber, who are, deemed essential, but whose livelihoods have been totally destroyed because there's absolutely they have no passengers. The traffic on those apps has totally plummeted since shelter in place. And a lot of drivers in San Francisco, tie it to the fact that most tech campuses, all tech campuses are shut down. And so which was, represented a lot of their clientele. And then on the other hand, you have drivers who are working for DoorDash and Instacart, where those services have just exploded since shelter in place, because people are, more people than ever are having their groceries delivered, food delivered. And so it's been a really interesting, people have a wide variety of experiences performing platform mediated work right now. And I would say that for those who are working for the food delivery apps, it's on the one hand, you hear from people that that work has never been busier, that they're making, much more money, and but then on the other hand, that the platform is providing them no guidelines for how to safely perform their work. They don't have any access to protective equipment, and of course, they don't. One of the things that they've been demanding in a series of labor actions that have taken place over the last few months is hazard pay, which is like a totally reasonable demand given the circumstances. I think there's one of the things that the pandemic has done is it's injected, I think, a new energy into organizing, specifically around issues of access to protective equipment, access to hazard pay, but it's also, I think, really highlighted for a lot of workers in like a very immediate way, the importance of the struggle around classification, because they're, part of how they're understanding these companies' unwillingness to give them any guidelines about, how should you, if you're spending 8 hours a day in a grocery store, you're an Instacart shopper, how should you protect yourself? Like, how should you handle items? How should you clean your car? They're realizing that the unwillingness of these companies to provide this information is very much bound up in their investment in making a legal argument that these workers are not employees. I think there's been a big uptick in activity, particularly among Instacart shoppers who have staged, I think, two walkouts now since the shelter in place began. And I think it's a really exciting development. And I think another thing that's interesting, and I talked about this on an earlier panel that I participated in, is like the ways in which the challenges that I think a lot of us are now facing as organizers are challenges that platform mediated workers are always having to deal with, which is that, they also do not share a physical space. They're dispersed, they're atomized, they're isolated, and yet they have to sort of figure out how to overcome that and coordinate with one another so that they can take the kind of collective action that they need to take to force concessions from capital and the state. So those are my thoughts on that.
That was great. Thank you. So we've gotten some really good questions from the audience. So I'm going to pivot from our, the immediate COVID crisis to another crisis that we might all be familiar with. So the question is, how is the climate crises and many current ecological or other ecological crises affecting socialist organizing? How should socialists and communists be building power along ecological lines? And anyone feel free to jump in.
Well, I guess I can start since I have, been working on this maybe most directly. It's a obviously extremely important question. I guess I would say so far, I think that How have we been? How has it affected? I think so. I guess I would say that I think the main thing so far that it seems to me that climate has brought to like socialist and communist organizing is the sense of urgency, a sense of like, wow, we really need to like transform the world quickly. And I think that that is very warranted. But I also think one of the things we need to really think about is how to both bring that urgency and like really recognize the really dire situation with climate and how, as I mentioned before, we're already in the climate crisis. It's happening now. It's going to keep happening. And we really are out of time and have been for some time now. And yet also recognizing that our recognition of that and our stating of that doesn't necessarily like move the things that we need it to move, and that is, I think, a real challenge and something that I've been struggling with a lot, because I think it's really I think we need to bring that kind of urgency into our work, but also like not get, I think, stuck in too much of it, or I guess not to give words like a catastrophism that's like, well, if we don't, if we don't stop capitalism and climate change in the next 10 years, like that is the end of like the world, the planet, the way that kind of, I think the use of the IPCC report that said 2 years ago said 12 years, we need to like cut emissions very drastically in the next 12 years to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now that's 10 years. It's not a lot of time. And I think that it's both really important to bring that kind of, again, rhetorical force of like, we have 10 years, we need to like get fucking going right now. While also not like, while also knowing, or I think it's fine to use that rhetoric, but we should also remember for ourselves that it's going to be a lot longer than 10 years. We are in this for the long haul, and climate change is going to be like a thing we have to grapple with basically forever. So we need to have the urgency, but also like some of the perspective, and I think also some strategies for just how do we cut carbon without necessarily expecting that to like within capitalism while also fighting against capitalism, and recognize that there's some like damage control that we really need to do so that we can keep people alive and keep the people who are the most vulnerable alive. And that is going to be like, I think a lot of what we need to be thinking about, and that's what we tried to argue for in A Planet to Win, is like ways that we can be cutting carbon in ways that like are addressing economic and racial inequality, that are addressing the specific kinds of social vulnerabilities that are going to be exacerbated by climate change. And I think we obviously need to continue to do that. And I guess one thing that I'd say, I think we have some ways to go on. I think this is it's just in like integrating climate change as a frame of analysis into all of our kinds of organizing work. And I think that's starting to happen, and it feels like a really different moment than even a few years ago, like where I think, socialist and communist organizers and organizations like are bringing climate into conversations around like work and housing and transit and all these kinds of things that are other kinds of, I guess, like issues. And I think we have to have like a kind of carbon climate analysis on all of those. And I think that's getting, again, so I think it's getting better, but we have some ways to go, and especially probably outside of like socialist and communist organizations, like in the labor movement, for example. I think there's like a growing interest in green jobs or like a Green New Deal to some degree, but it's probably not like the center of a lot of labor organizing right now, right? Like there's a lot, I think there's still a lot of work to do to connect the idea that climate politics is happening everywhere, not just like in the UN or in like a carbon tax or whatever, but that like climate politics is all around us. It's in like how we live and how we get around and how we work, and that we can bring that analysis to a lot of places. But I think we have to like keep, I think, thinking about how to do that in ways that aren't just saying like drop what you're doing and talk about climate change, but like how do you see this as connected to the other things we're already doing? How can we see like something like a rent strike connecting to demands for affordable housing and like dense places connected to transit where people can get around without a car and also afford to live, and have the kinds of like, access to spaces of collective consumption. So like parks and gardens and museums and all of these things that right now are like really disproportionately distributed. And that I worry right now, people are obviously like not going to those places right now, but eventually they should again. And that we need to think about how all of these things be part of like a good life and a free life, in the way that Jeremy's talking about, and how these can be part of like a vision of freedom. And I'm really excited to see that, like the language of freedom coming back into left conversations, because I think that's going to be really important for articulating like the life we want and the life we're fighting for.
Yeah, I think that's really some really good food for thought there, especially, how do we kind of, these issues are very intertwined, right, with climate and housing, and I think it's going to make our organizing much deeper for that. So I have a question. It kind of relates, I think, to a question we got from the audience, specifically directed to Olivia, but I think anyone else can also feel free to chime in. So earlier you were talking about different ways that DSA could approach being a separate force, a full-time kind of force. So what are the localities? So let me quote this question. What kind of localities to scale are you thinking for your proposed breakout DSA? Interested in how the other DSA members feel about the proposal. And also, Jeremy, what's kind of your long-term Labor Party member take on that? What's the sorry, I'm gesturing again, it's probably broken the camera. Is breaking away the best strategy in your mind? I'm curious for both of your thoughts there, or anyone else who wants to chime in too.
Yeah, so I am really looking at like a state by state context. Like I said, there's no way that we're going to be like, okay, DSA is a national party now, let's run Bernie on a third party ticket. We did it. That's not going to happen. I think that it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of trial and error and failure and, building on small successes. But I mean, I think Democrats want you to think this is impossible. And we are also ingrained into thinking that way because that's the narrative we've been sold. And, that's the way we've been playing the game. But I mean, of course, you have to look at your own context. But in Oregon, we can get on the ballot for a state house race as a socialist party with 500 signatures. That is nothing. So if we start small, we start local, it's going to take many years. But this is always the conversation that we want to do this eventually. It's not the time yet. If we want to do this eventually, we have to start small and we have to start now laying the groundwork. And I think that, obviously, of course, there are these rules that would keep us out and keep these major parties entrenched. But once we qualify, we are also entrenched in the same way. We've got a small group, working on looking at all of these things. I'm not like well-versed in election law or anything, but it is possible for us to do, especially if we start in the state by state way. I think we would have to have like 20 state parties winning elections before we can talk about coordinating a national party movement. It would take a long time. And the other question was, I think, what kind of support is there in DSA? That's a really good question. I think that these conversations are just happening right now because the Bernie campaign just ended. I've kind of seen takes all over the map. I know that people are like hosting webinars and stuff in the coming months to talk about this specifically. So hopefully we will have more of an articulated vision in the coming months and year.
I hope so. Jeremy, do you want to comment on kind of the Labor Party? Because I think there's kind of a similar, or correct me if I'm wrong here, kind of a similar thing going on over there.
Well, I can, but I'm really keen to hear what the other DSA people say as well, because I mean, like I said before, this is I feel like this is, I was in the States for a few months earlier this year, and I've got lots of friends there, and I try and follow the situation. But this issue of whether you should give up on taking over the Democratic Party or not is one of those issues I feel like you've really got to live in a place and be immersed in it to really have an opinion on it. And so, which is also the same with Brexit, by the way. So all you American leftists with an opinion on Brexit, shut up. So well, with the Labour, I would say the situation is very, I mean, for obvious reasons, the situation is very different. Okay, so I mean, my own relationship to this historic question is that, partly just personally is, like, I spent literally decades being the only person I knew and kind of the only person. I mean, there are some people, there are a few people of the kind of 60s generation who took this position, but virtually, as far as I knew, kind of the only person of my entire generation, so the entire kind of Generation X generation who I was aware of, who took the position that you had to have a kind of dual strategy to get anywhere with the left politics. You had to both do kind of street level activism and do movement based and kind of libertarian organizing, and also you had to have some kind of position in relation to the Labour Party, and recognise that in throughout British political history, since the beginning of mass suffrage, you do not make any progress if you don't win the argument in the Labour Party. You might win it from the outside, you might exert pressure from the outside, you might exert it from within, but you've got to be engaged with it. And so for me, it was a kind of massive sort of relief, and I was very happy to see all these kind of younger activists and people coming from the kind of movements coming into the party and really sort of transforming its culture and taking that matter seriously. But to what extent that that is, and in the UK, nobody is seriously talking about a breakaway from the Labour Party. Like, nobody seriously thinks there's any scope for a far left party or a party to the left. But the situation on a sort of class, in terms of the sort of class relations, is very, very similar. That basically you saw a cohort of sort of centrist, basically the residual neoliberal professional political class, just doing absolutely everything it could to prevent a Corbyn government, despite the fact that the alternative was going to be something really, really bad. And on the other hand, the situations are also different for several reasons. It was different in that we got the leadership of the party, and that we were able to make all kinds of institutional gains and quite lasting kind of institutional and kind of ideological gains simply on the basis of the fact that we did show we could occupy the leadership of the party for several years. So, and there isn't really an equivalent. Having the leadership of the Labour Party is the equivalent of having the presidential nomination and having control of the DNC, for example, basically. And so we were able to do that, and also Corbyn was not a kind of popular figure. He was never personally popular. There was never an opinion poll that made it look like Corbyn could actually win an election. So there was the difference was that we all know Bernie would have won. And he was and they wouldn't let him. The polls were just there showing that he would win, and they wouldn't let him anyway. So I can very much see the argument for sort of giving up on the Democratic Party. The only thing I would say about it, I would say, and this is kind of echoes what other people have said. Look, in both cases, you're talking about. In both cases, it's only a couple of years basically into a process which I think only really did begin in 2015. I take seriously Sarah's point about the significance of movement politics in the years prior to that. But I would also say, look, there is no 5-year period in the history of capitalism, especially liberal capitalism, then where in any country in the world where you don't get cycles of protest occurring. And I'm not sure that even Occupy was that different from what happened sort of 10 years before it, or 10 years before that, or 10 years before that. Whereas the re-emergence of the socialist left as a significant force, and as a force that's engaged in both kind of union organizing and sort of street level organizing and electoral politics is really, really significant. And it's the re-emergence, and that is after a period of 30 years really, when the organized left was just not. It just didn't exist to all intents and purposes, and this was true in both the UK and the US. So it was clearly there was no. I just think it's a sort of analytical mistake to say, "Oh, Bernie lost" or Corbyn lost. Actually, there was no objective chance of them actually winning those electoral positions, despite the fact that. Also, at the same time, of course, we had to go through the motions of acting like they could, because and we did make huge propaganda gains by doing so, and we had to take the opportunity to make those propaganda and recruitment gains by doing so, and that's what we've seen that with the growth of the SA, we've seen that with the growth of the organised left in the UK. So we did what we had to do, and there was no chance that the outcome was actually going to be those guys occupying the presidency, or number 10 Downing Street. And so I don't know how much we can infer from those kind of quote unquote failures or successes. I also think the elements that blocked Corbyn and the elements that blocked Sanders, you know, getting the Democratic nomination, look, you're talking about a kind of sort of coalition of class fractions, really, who have been hegemonic for the past 30 years. You know, they have been, you're talking about sort of the professional political class, and, you know, I don't really like the term, but the sort of professional managerial class, who still, I don't think it would have been reasonable for them to expect them to have realized in the space of 4 or 5 years that the universe they had lived in for the past 30, 40 years is completely over, is not coming back, is not reversible. So I don't think they ever would have just sort of capitulated or not done everything in their power to prevent, Bernie winning or Corbyn winning at this historical stage. I think in another 5 years, I think if this was another 5 years down the road, then you could say, look, if they're going to try that hard, if they're going to fight that hard, then give up on it, give up on this electoral vehicle. Right now, I think, it seems like sort of objectively it might be kind of too early to say. So that would be an argument against completely giving up on the Democratic Party. But on the other hand, as I said before, even having been through a very similar experience in the States, I mean, the sight of the whole kind of American middle class just not taking on board the fact that the polls were showing that Bernie was going to win and like not acting and just still basically not wanting him. I can see that that's very good evidence for the argument that Olivia's making.
Yeah, I just want to respond really quickly because we have this saying, Bernie would have won. And that premise is that Bernie would have won in a general election. If you believe that Bernie would have won, then you are already on board with a key premise of the feasibility of a new party without realizing it. We believe Bernie would have won in a general election because that consists of more unaffiliated voters than either registered Democrats or Republicans. Bernie does better with this voting bloc than anyone else. He also presented a draw to, typical Republican voters who would support Medicare for all, which is like half of Republican voters. So if we believe this to be true, that Bernie would have won, then it's obvious that the Democrat primary is much less friendly terrain for left-wing ideas than a general election because he has lost both Democratic primaries. These wealthier individuals and these establishment bootlickers are just more likely to vote in Democrat primaries than the larger turnout and less partisan general elections. This does not mean that Bernie would have won if he ran an independent campaign for president right now, as I said. But I think we can apply this premise that general elections are more friendly to left-wing ideas to these smaller races right now. So we can win with this premise right now in state house races, in city council races, and so on.
That's such a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. So I'm going to go to another audience question. This one is for you, Nick. I think maybe see how much time we left. Maybe be a good final question, I think. So let's see, I'm going to read the question here. Nick, you talked about the swapping of energy during the UCSC strike, but this loss of energy seems generalized across social and political organizing today. Is that feeling correct? Are contemporary socialist movements exhausted? What do you think the best ways to mobilize are today? Not just projects, but energy. That was in all caps. Energy. How do we get that energy?
Oh, if I knew. I think it's an exhausting time to be in. I think that there was a real convergence. We're talking about the counterinsurgent wing in the Democratic Party. Also, this is all happening alongside the rise of COVID, and locally it's happening with the effort to break our strike, even in this moment when we see the we see the sparks of a very different outcome. And I think that is part of one thing that I think we need to hold on to is just that we see, and this is going to what Olivia's saying, it's just we are seeing the other history happening. And to see it stalled so intensely, to see the kind of kind of organized counterinsurgency that's necessary in order for it, whether intentional or whether, like, you know, actually the parts that we can't control with the pandemic. All of those things in the way that they conspire are signs that we're not just in that history that's sapping the energy, it's that part of the way that we're moving is in the right direction. It's just really difficult to see it right now. And so I think, like, in this moment, in the sheltering moment, for those of us who can work remotely, for those of us who are not essential workers, like, I think that's one thing to cultivate, and to continue cultivating those very social relations that were sustaining us and that can sustain us in the future. But I definitely agree that it seems to be characteristic of the parts of the left that I'm in, and I think that it's okay to grieve, and I think that's like, it's okay to grieve also because that's not the only place we're going to stay. And so, you know, I think in many ways what I saw right on the cusp of shelter in place was a really important convergence between various different worker and student movements. I saw a movement for a cost of living campaign that also unexpectedly also became a campaign against policing. I've seen people start to connect the dots, whether at the level of the budget, whether at the level of the ways in which capitalism expresses itself, between counterinsurgency and strike breaking and prisons and policing. And all of those conversations don't have to stop now. And so I think just nurturing them in this moment when we have the capacity, even as it feels stalled, is also making space for those other ways in which we can grow while this is happening and in its wake.
I think that's a really wonderful thought to kind of bring this to a close on, actually. So thank you all so much. I'm going to ask Philip to drop back in and see if he has any other questions or comments that he kind of wants to add to this discussion.
Red May is an endless meeting. I think the lucidity with people pose the Democratic Party question is fascinating to unpack a little. Everybody here, I think, believes, one, that taking over the Democratic Party is a lost cause. Two, that you can't run as a third party because the system is so undemocratically set up that you have to do some strategy like build over very many years on let's say a state-by-state level. Meantime, the time frame that we're facing in terms of when we need action is very, very short because of climate change and other problems. And I wonder if there isn't another alternative to frame why we are mobilizing people like Bernie to run in the party. I think the goal is not to win the election. I mean, that would be nice, but we don't expect it to happen because there are so many undemocratic obstacles set up for getting a candidate in. It's to push these rotten institutions to overload to the point that they destroy themselves in the process of the campaign. All around the world, there is a total distrust with every kind of official party. But because people are not policy wonks or institutional wonks, they don't really know all of those anti-democratic obstacles that are set up in terms of people getting through. And the purpose of the 5-month campaign is to bring those to the foreground in ways that make people angry and eventually cause them, because they're very weak and they're tottering, to dissolve. I mean, you have, for example, and you know, you have 6-month debate period with 15 candidates that's part of the DNC bit, which is a game of Survivor. It's essentially something that's posed not to answer any questions, but to face everybody off against each other and ask questions not like, why is it that every other advanced industrial democracy can have single-payer medical care, which was a question posed by a candidate, Bernie, which should have been posed by a moderator in any fair debate because people will want to know it. It's instead, Mr. Bloomberg, Senator Sanders thinks that billionaires shouldn't exist. Should you exist? It seems to me that if there were in that a slate of 20 candidates, there were 3 kind of left progressives, that their strategy during the debate is to call out every stupid question that happens and say, why aren't you asking this? In a way that you literally question the way the thing is posed, and that every step along the way should expose what it is that forces the candidates to follow this narrow path and produces the same result every time. I'm not suggesting that's a particular strategy. I'm suggesting that what we need to do is the Democratic Party is not going to go away. It has to ultimately meet the destruction it's been courting. That might seem, my God, you'll be leaving the Republicans in the landscape, but we need parties that are real parties, that are parties that are created from the base through dues, as opposed to parties that are built around entrepreneur candidates seeking to recruit a base for each election campaign, as Seth Ackerman said in Jacobin. And I think unless we deal with destroying all those anti-democratic institutions, we're going to be perpetually caught in this dilemma of take part of the Democratic Party or not. So I'd be interested in people's response in that as one notion. Or maybe we leave that with a go-away thought, and it becomes part of our. The other thing I'd like to say is I just love the freedom is an endless meeting thing from Jeremy, because it's so anti-neoliberal, which is all about everybody becoming entrepreneurs of themselves and bringing the belief that no collective action of any kind will ever have any good result for me unless it's some kind of networking. And, you know, I mean, the notion that the meeting is also a party, but the party is also a meeting, just seems to me to hark back to those good moments at Columbia 68. I'm sorry, Nick, I know you roll your eyes for that. I won't do that. But, you know, I won't go into those things. But, you know, that notion that brings kind of sociability into planning and makes it a pleasurable experience, that we together are working on our own destinies and thinking together, which is also, by the way, what is pleasurable about education, which is not sitting in front of a screen and being fed information, but being part of that sociable notion. So I would add to, as a final thing, freedom is an endless nomadic meeting, because the idea is, just like in Plato, where all the dialogues take where you're walking from one place to the other, the meeting will start in one place, it'll go to a bar, it'll go to somewhere else, but it's the same kind of endless ongoing discussion. So those are my thoughts. This is a wonderful conversation, and I thank you all, Nick, Alyssa, Olivia, Sarah, Jeremy, and Hannah, for your moderation. And I wish everybody Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Oh wait, it's not that date, but come back to our next Red May at 6 o'clock, belabored in Seattle. Please go to click on donate and help us do another Red May. It's on our website, www.redmayseattle.org. Thanks very much. Wave.